Hello and welcome to the 2022 International Open Seminar on Semiotics, a tribute to John Deely on the 5th anniversary of his passing. This seminar is a collaborative international open scientific initiative and a celebration that connects thousands of scholars and organizations around the world. The sessions will run throughout all the year, so please stay tuned and follow our schedule. We are joining here today to explore the matter of formal sign in Coimbra school. And we are very happy here today to feature Hélène Leblanc. Please allow me to introduce you to our audience. Dr. Hélène Leblanc is a historian of philosophy and of semiotics, working mostly on the late scholasticism of the 16th and 17th century and on the Austro-Germanic tradition, involving such authors as Bolzano, Brentano, Husserl, Marti, and Myung. She has a strong interest in philosophy of language and mind. In 2015, she earned her PhD in semiotic theory in early modern philosophy under the supervision of Philippe Aumont and Yulia Belgioso. Her major scientific achievement is a monograph on semiotic theories in the 17th century entitled Théorie sémiotique de l'âge classique and published in Vrans in 2021. Dr. Leblanc has also written several articles, especially on scholastic and early modern philosophy and on Austro-Germanic tradition. She collaborates with ARC School Art and particularly this project at the crossroad of history of art, French literature, and Neo-Latin literature, aims at highlighting the scholastic background of these three fields. Dr. Leblanc is also a founding member of Inbegriff, Geneva Seminar for Austro-German Philosophy, and is a co-editor of Studia Philosophica. Thank you very much, Dr. Leblanc, for being here with us. Please, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Yulia, for the introduction. I just will share my screen now. Okay, can you see it? Okay, perfect. So, first, I'm extremely grateful for being part of this International Open Seminar on Semiotics, a tribute to John Deely. My most sincere thanks go to Robert Junquera for the organization and Yulia Nikitenko as well, and as well Mario Santiago de Carvalho, and all the organizers of the seminar. I am very happy to be here, and I thank as well all the attendees of the session. I am even more honored that years ago, when I began my PhD, one of my first publications was a critique to John Deely. To be clear, I do not intend saying so to provocatively deny the value of Deely's work. And by the way, I never denied such a value included in the mentioned paper. Moreover, I think it is the destiny of pioneers like John Deely was to be exposed to an easy criticism by their followers. However, I do not intend either to express a full plain regret for this critique. In a simpler way, I am extremely happy and grateful for having been invited here and to have the opportunity to quickly come back on my views on Deely's work and to discuss them with his admirers and likers. I will very quickly expose these views, which involve the text edited by Deely under the name of Tractatus Maximus. Just a moment. Okay. By Jean Poinçot, or John of St. Thomas, namely the Spanish Dominican of the early 17th century who wrote this Tractatus de Signis. And this will be the way I will introduce the very topic of my talk, namely the semiotics, which is to be found in the commentary on Aristotle De Interpretatione of the Coimbrenses, namely the Jesuit professors of the University of Coimbra in Coimbra at the age of the 17th century. This commentary has mainly been written by Sebastião de Couto, so I will speak mainly of Couto and Couto's work. Okay, then. So this is how my talk will go on. So first, this introduction based on my first critique and a tribute as well to John Deely. Then the place of Coimbra semiotics within a long durée perspective. Then Coimbra semiotics within a closer context, their contemporary context, and finally some conclusions. So, the texts on science by Couto and Poinçot have been edited and translated in a partial way according to an approach that tends to make the authors in question the precursors of a revolution of which our modernity will be the direct heir. This process begins with the republication in the 30s of the 20th century under the influence of Neotomism of Poinçot's work. Jacques Maritain devoted many pages to these authors and introduced him to the semiologist Thomas Sebioc and his first translator, John Deely, who published in 1985 the first edition of the Tractatus de Signis as an autonomous work with a translation into English. According to John Deely, the originality of Poinçot originates in a conception of science which is derived from a revolutionary doctrine of the relation that overcomes the traditional division between nature and culture. Poinçot will then represent the systematic moment of a unified theory of science, which will be named semiotics, for the first time by John Locke, at the end of the essay on human understanding, and which will reach its completion point with Charles Sanders Peirce. So this is Deely's thesis, and this thesis quickly became a doxa in semiotics textbooks. Deely's work and approach is fruitful on at least three aspects. It allows the rediscovery of Poinçot's text, which was neglected, and it provides a reference edition, an English translation of important parts of it. And it paves the way for numerous other translations in many languages. Second, it drew the attention on the importance of late scholasticism, and not only the medieval one, in particular for what regards semiotic issues. Then it stressed the importance of Poinçot's doctrine on science in relation to contemporary semiotics, and in particular with the Peircean one. However, each of these aspects presents a certain weakness. So to one, there is a twofold partiality. First, Poinçot is not the only late scholastic to deal with science. For instance, Stefan Meyerhofer in Die Spur des Zeichens has provided an accurate panorama of late scholastic discussions on science, and in particular on the division between instrumental and formal sign that allows to discuss the semiotic status of concepts. And I will come back extensively on that point later on. Meyerhofer traces back the origin of the discussion with Pierre Dailly and Domingo de Soto after him, and it describes variety of the positions among, for instance, Pedro da Fonseca, Francisco Duarte, Francisco Suarez, Paulius Vallius, Sebastián Izquierdo, as well as the Jesuits of Alcalá, André Semery, Scipione Chiaramonti, the Dominicans Samuel de Lublino and Domenico Bañez, Francisco de Arrojo, the Franciscan John Punch, and the Benedictine Matthias Weiss. Then John Deely presents himself as the author of an interpretative arrangement of Poinçon's Tractatus de Signis. It is correct that Poinçon speaks of his own text as a Tractatus de Signis et Notitis, that is, a treatise on signs and notions, notions being referred to both sensory and intelligible knowledge. However, this is not exactly a title for Poinçon, but rather a description which appears only in Poinçon's original text within the preface, and not at the beginning of the commentary to Periermeneias, or the Interpretation. Besides, in arrangements such as Deely's one, the second part of Poinçon's striking title is cancelled to keep only the first one, Tractatus de Signis, in the sense that it loses the et notitis part. Then to point to, this is a rather too obvious criticism, but late scholasticism semiotics is preceded by medieval semiotics, and I will come back on this later. To the third point, there are risks of anachronism. When it comes to the many possible ways of dealing with historical materials, one can often observe a tension between two main options in scholarly literature. On the one side, one can consider an author as breaking new grounds for revolution, which is supposedly leads directly to our modernity. And this is Deely's standpoint, and as I said, it is a fruitful standpoint. On the other hand, there is a tendency to focus not on possible anticipations, but on detailed contextualization. In such a case, however, one faces the risk of smoothing away any originality of the author at stake. So there are risks and advantages on both standpoints. At the time of the publication of Deely's translation of Poinçon, two scholars have illustrated the contextualist standpoint, Costantino Marmot and Jennifer Ashworth. Marmot criticizes Deely on his editorial methodology. He insists on Cajetan and Suarez's influence on Poinçon. Ashworth shows that Poinçon remains traditional since both Francisco de Toledo and Sebastião de Couto previously placed the discussion on science in the commentary to the Periermeneias, and since Poinçon borrows his theory of the relation from Domingo de Soto. My own studies attempted to read authors like Poinçon with a look to their own context. This I borrowed to scholars such as Ashworth or Marmot. However, I think I stand close to Deely's standpoint in the sense that I acknowledge the value of a wide perspective on history, a longue durée history, in which authors are inscribed in order to stress relative differences and to value original specificities. So the account I just gave aimed at stressing my standpoint within a seminar dedicated to John Deely and to his approach on the history of semiotics. It aims also at introducing the topic of my talk, the doctrine of the science in Coimbra at the edge of modernity. So how Deely's work is connecting with the reception of the Coimbrenses' questions on science. First, there is a historical connection or a material filiation. François published his cursus 30 years later and was undoubtedly subject to other influences, but the Dominican, who would later become a professor at the University of Alcalá, was trained by the Jesuits in Coimbra, where he received the title of Magister Artium. And it is therefore probable that he was imbued with the teaching disseminated in the commentary written in Coimbra. Secondly, there is a connection within the scholarship itself. As said before, John Deely published the first edition of the Tractatus de Signis, and in the same years, the 80s of the 20th century, John Doyle described the Coimbra questions on science in an article entitled The Coimbra on the Relations Involved in Science, which appeared in the proceeding of a conference debated by Deely himself. This article is followed in 2001 by the English translation of the questionnaires. Doyle made his edition and translation in a similar vein to that of Deely. Doyle presents Coimbra's questionnaires as the first truly great treatise on science, as such that we have from the scholastic period. This was a quote. But without mentioning, for example, Roger Bacon's De Signis, which is dated back the 13th century. In answer to such an assessment, my own standpoint is in favor of contextualization, and it will be the standpoint according to which I choose here to provide an account of Coimbra's doctrine on science. First, according to a longue durée standpoint, and second, looking at a closer context. So I will begin with this longue durée history. Many medieval histories trace back the notion of science to two main sources. The beginning of Aristotle's treatise Perirmeneias, or De Interpretatione, and the Augustinian definition of the sign coming from the De Doctrina Christiana. Here is Aristotle's text, now spoken sounds or symbols of affections in the soul, and written marks, symbols of spoken sounds, and just as written marks are not the same for all men, neither are spoken sounds. But what these are in the first place signs of affections of the soul are the same for all, and what these affections are likenesses of actual things are also the same. The Aristotelian text presents the relation between words, ideas, and things. It will be translated and interpreted in the first place by Boethius. This text considers language from the point of view of its intrinsic properties. By contrast, Augustine reads, a sign is a thing which, besides the form that it presents to the sense, evokes something different in the mind. Augustine's definition of the sign is characterized, on the contrary, by its attention to the context of communication. This is De Doctrina Christiana definition, but there is a slight different version in the De Dialectica. Moreover, this definition is characterized by two features. Firstly, the sign is something perceptible by the senses. And secondly, there is a dual knowledge or two ideas, the idea of the sign and the idea of the signified thing. According to this definition, the extension of the notion of sign covers both natural signs, as smoke for fire, and conventional signs, as words for ideas or things, depends. As we will see, this will be alternatively considered as too restrictive or, on the contrary, as too loose. as a definition. It remains that the Augustinian definition is the main reference for the definition of the sign during the whole medieval period. It is embedded first within the theological context for the definition of the sacrament by Peter Lombard, and then in the logical context to speak about words. It is so widespread that it is not only referred to Augustine himself, but also to Cicero, Isidore of Sevilla, and even Aristotle himself. As a matter of fact, the history of the Augustinian definition is also that of its critique. This criticism is rooted in the first scholastic context of the discussion of science, the theological context. It takes a new turn when, from John Duns Scotus onwards, concepts begin to be considered as science, which is actually in line with the Boetian interpretation of the perihermeneias. The criteria of being perceptible by the senses and of the numerical separation of the sign and what is signified weigh heavily on the comprehension of the concepts, opening the way to a thought which will conceive them as intermediate beings. William of Ockham will ridiculise the criticism to develop a semiotic thought from an even more clearly cognitive standpoint, to the point of making explicitly concepts the natural signs of things. In any case, the medieval history of the notion of the sign unites around these two texts, Aristotle, De Interpretatione, and Augustine, De Doctrina Christiana. However, they are dealt with in separate textual places. Even when the Augustinian definition is criticized, as I said, within the theological context, and then, as we shall see, in the logico-grammatical field, it does not occur within commentaries on the perihermeneias. On the contrary, it will be the case with Sebastião do Couto in Coimbra, and later on with Poinçot. So the question is, what was the difficulty raised by the confrontation of Aristotle and Augustine's texts? What happened during the late 16th century or the early 17th century that made possible their meeting? Or in other words, the import of Augustine's definition within the commentary on Aristotle's main passage on words, ideas, and things. So the hypothesis is the following. The explicit collusion between these two references occurs when arises within the late scholastic context the debate around the denomination of formal sign, which designates in the first place the concepts, contrasted with the instrumental sign, which is the sign according to its first and narrow Augustinian meaning, and which designates the whole of the sensory signs, in the first rank of which appear the words. In a nutshell, the translatio of the Augustinian definition of a sign within the commentary on the first chapter of Aristotle's Perihermeneias gives rise to a wave of treatises on signs, bearing explicitly such a title, although it is more often a section title and not a treatise title. So I will attempt to provide some reasons for the emergence of the formal sign debate. The main one is that it derives from centuries of critique of the Augustinian definition that is considered to be too narrow for a definition of sign that should allow to explain mental representation. So I will begin with the medieval critique of Augustine's definition of a sign. The first critique addressed to definition is that it cannot take into account non-sensory signs. This critique was formulated in the 13th century by medieval thinkers, among which one finds Richard Fishak, Thomas Aquinas, and Roger Bacon. They consider the Augustinian restriction a cost too high to pay, since they want to explain through the notion of a sign non-sensory processes such as angelic communication, the Eucharistic sacrament, and concepts and intelligible species, namely the instruments of mental representation. The first critique gives rise to definitions which remove the sensory aspect of the sign from the Augustinian definition to keep only the difference between the sign, which is manifest, and the thing signified, which is hidden. Here we have Aquinas' definition, for instance. One can know the sign through the senses or through the intellect, as is the case with Eucharistic sacrament. If Christ is truly present, there is no more bread after transubstantiation occurs, but the species of the bread remain as signs. So a broad definition of a sign is necessary also to explain angelic communication, since angels are not bound to a body, or to have an ID as the sign of another ID, or finally to claim that IDs are signs of things. This last case motivates the 13th century philosopher Roger Bacon to claim or to give the definition of a sign. A sign, moreover, is something that, once presented to a sensory faculty or an intellect, designates something to that intellect. As Aristotle bears witness, who says that the soul's experiences are signs of things. Roger Bacon wrote extensively on signs. His views have been thoroughly studied. In particular, it has been stressed that he enlarged the definition of a sign, so to something that, once present to a sensory faculty or an intellect, designates something to that intellect. That is, to something that is not only sensory but also intellectual. And it is worth noting that Bacon does so explicitly in order to include the soul's experiences, that he provides one of the first analyses of the sign according to its being relational, as well as a very detailed classification of the different kinds of signs. However, one question remains, why would it be worth describing ideas as signs? Another question immediately follows, why philosophers won't remain satisfied with such an enlarged definition of a sign? In other words, which difficulties does it raise? Indeed, such a broad definition of the sign allows for a homogeneous account of semantic relations, faithful to Boëthius' reading of Aristotle's On Interpretation. The written word signifies the spoken word, which signifies the idea that signifies the thing. This account has at least two philosophical implications. First, there is an implicit hierarchy if a sign is considered as less perfect than what it signifies, from spoken word to divine word through mental word. Second, there is an isomorphism between the level of language and that of thought, and possibly also the level of things as well as the divine level. This might lead one to postulate the existence of a mental language, as with William of Ockham, and or to claim that there is a universal grammar. Whose major exponents are those grammarians of the late 13th century called modistae. There is an additional argument in favor of the broadening of the definition of a sign. It is given by another author of the 13th century, which is the pseudo-Quilworthy. He raises the epistemic issue of the constitution of a science of signs. Since there is only science about what is universal, and since the senses alone do not allow access to the universal, the sign, according to its Augustinian definition, cannot be the object of a true science. The criticism to the Augustinian definition is thus a complex, traditional element of its reception. It also passes from context to context, so from a theological context where it is already criticized, from a more grammatical context, and finally to a logical context. And this criticism should not be reduced to the diffusion of an Ockhamism which makes concepts the first of the signs. However, this is how it is used in logic, and it is indeed within the nominalist milieu of the 14th century that the name signum mentale spreads in reference to the concept, qua the first object of logic before the verbal signs. The signum mentale is to be found in the theological context with Gregory of Rimini and William Craton. The expression is also widespread in logic, as shown, for example, in the 15th century by Florentius Diel. The mental sign, I translate the quotation, the mental sign is the first and principal sign without which neither the pronounced words nor the written traces can signify. The text of the Peri-Hermeneias is thus reinterpreted. Whereas previously only the spoken and written words were called signs, the affection of the soul, which were similarities, become in their turn signs. Such mental signs are, moreover, the necessary condition for the non-natural signs. This reinterpretation of the Aristotelian text passes by widely spread criticism of the Augustinian definition of the sign. We thus see progressively appearing an alternative definition of a sign, much broader, according to which the sign is that which represents something to the cognitive power, based around which gravitate numerous variants, and which is characterized above all by the preponderance of the relation of the sign to the intellect, newly called cognitive power. This new definition demonstrates an important fusion of the vocabularies of signification and representation, and it becomes an uncontested basis from the end of the 14th century. It is extended and radicalized in particular with the School of Paris of John Mayer at the beginning of the 16th century. The members of this school took signification in the general sense of making something known to someone, taking up the Boeotian tradition of the interpretation of Peri-Hermeneias 16b, which defines the act of signifying as that which makes one understand, or intellectum constituere. This very broad definition relies on the interchangeability of the terms significar and representar. Okay, so I come to my first results with this longue durée perspective. The definition of a sign as what represents something to the cognitive power is precisely the one which is given by Sebastião de Couto, so the author of the Logic of Coimbra. More exactly, after mentioning Augustine's definition, Couto describes it as too narrow to fit all types of signs. It perfectly fits the instrumental signs, namely the signs which need to be known as such in order to lead to the knowledge of the signified thing, such as do words. One needs to hear the uttered word in order to access to its meaning. However, the Augustinian definition is not large enough to include the formal signs, namely signs which does not need to be known, as such in order to lead to the knowledge of the signified thing, such as do ideas, I mean concepts and intelligible species. Couteau reports that is the reason why logicians work out a larger definition of a sign as what represents something to a knowing power, able to include intelligible species and concepts. So my main claim on the place of Coimbra semiotics within the longue durée perspective of medieval and late medieval scholastic semiotics is the following. The innovative aspect of Coimbra lies in the introduction of Augustine's definition within the commentary of Perermeneias. What are the reasons to do that? In a nutshell, as said before, in the beginning of the Perermeneias, Aristotle provides an account of the relations between words, ideas, and things. The relations between these elements are semiotic. However, Aristotle does not provide in the same passage a definition of a sign. Admittedly, there is the definition provided at the end of the prior analytics. So there is an Aristotelian definition of a sign. It's a sign is meant to be a demonstrative proposition, either necessary or reputable. However, the medieval scholastics in general, except Albert Magnus, received the Perermeneias on the one hand and the rhetoric and the prior analytics on the other as belonging to different contexts. And for this reason, they did not try to bring them together. Moreover, the fortune of the Perermeneias, opposed to the later reception of the prior analytics and of the rhetoric, explained to a large extent why the passage illustrating Aristotelian semiotics is the famous text of the first chapter of Perermeneias, a passage in which the sign is not defined. So in other words, since the Perermeneias deals with semantics, it is difficult to import into it an Aristotelian definition which is purely logical, such as the one of prior analytics. On the contrary, Augustine offers a doctrine of the sign that is often described as non-inferential. Moreover, Augustine in the De Dialectica and the De Magistro provides the first united theory of the sign and language. The linguistic sign, based on the revealed word, imposes itself as a model for general semiotic theory. There is also a doctrinal reason to the integration of the Augustinian definition within the Perermeneias. The Neoplatonic Boeotian reading of the Perermeneias imposes a hierarchy which echoes in Augustine the gradation between the signs of language, the things of the world that are vestigia, referring to the one pure res, that is God, but also to the theory of inner speech. An Augustinian reference is also in line with Ammonius' commentary on the Perermeneias, highlighting the Plotinian idea that vocal language is an imitation of inner speech, which is identified with the pathemata tes psyches, or the affections of the soul of the Aristotelian text. In a nutshell, there are good reasons, good doctrinal reasons, in favor of the introduction of Augustine's definition of a sign within the commentary of Aristotle's main passage on the relation between words, ideas, and things. That is the beginning of the Perermeneias. However, this happens only during the 16th century, from Coimbra's commentaries preceded by a few others, such as Francisco de Toledo, and afterwards, included with Poinçot. This happens only when the beginning of the Perermeneias becomes one of the high places of discussions of the doctrine of signs. So this happens, rephrasing, when chapter 1 of the Perermeneias becomes not earlier than the second part of the 16th century, something like a treatise on science. Why does this happen? One may suggest that the medieval scholastics do not need a definition of sign in the commentary of the Periermeneias because they rely mostly on the Boeotian translation. I put there just a few translations, included Boethius 1. Because Boethius, as it is known, translated both semeion and symbolon as nota and not as signum. However, this is not a sufficient reason. Since also signum is not used in Boethius' translation, it is used in the medieval commentaries on the passage. The conclusion should be that medieval scholastics have other places where to provide a doctrine on science. Such places are, as mentioned before, Peter Lombard's sentences on sacraments, and in particular with the diffusion of Ockhamism, treatises on logic, the said logic of terms. However, at the end of the 15th century in Paris, Pierre Crockert contributes to the revival of Thomism by replacing within the theological curriculum the study of the sentences by that of Aquinas Summa Theologica. So the initial and usual place of analysis of the sign disappears, leaving this place for a new framework from the semiotic doctrine. This innovation spreads in the Iberian scholasticism through Francisco de Victoria, who has been Crockert's student in Paris. This is historically related to the exode of the Iberian philosophers in general fleeing the anti-Spanish climate after Francis I's defeat in Pavia. Okay. So the Iberians has brought back to their homeland both the semiotic innovations of the School of Paris, namely the apogee of late Germanist scholasticism, and the reform of the theological curriculum, which was anchored in a general renewal of Thomism. This renewal is related both to Aquinas being made Doctor of the Church in 1568 and to the Jesuits who have made of him their main reference. However, such a general renewal of Thomism does not go smoothly. Aquinas' texts give a hard time to its interpreters. In particular, they will want to defend an orthodox Thomism and to solve the contradictions raised by the influence of Scotism for what regards mental representation. The passage at the beginning of the Periermeneias, dealing with ideas, words, and things, acquired by then a new relevance. One last reason to the transformation of the commentaries on Periermeneias into treatises on science is the following. Compared to medieval commentaries that aim at extensively comment work, modern scholastics have a greater formal flexibility that enables them to dedicate a particular interest to such or such question, in this case, the questions on science. Thus, Kuto's questiones on the first chapter of the Periermeneias transforms the few lines of Aristotle's introductory summary on words, ideas, and sayings into a treatise on science, which will argue in favor of formal science, concept and species, along with instrumental science. The Periermeneias has become the place for the doctrine of the sign, so requiring a definition. Augustine and the traditional critique of his definition of a sign will thus be embedded into Aristotle's text. As we've seen, according to the longue durée perspective that I suggest here, Coimbra semiotics lies as the result of the long process of criticizing Augustine's definition and broadening it in order to include concepts or ideas. It is very close to Ponceau's standpoint, who argue as well in favor of formal science. However, it is not the main position within the late scholastic context. So I will now look at Coimbra semiotics with a closer look to context, to the close context. And so I will deal with late scholasticism and the global tendency to acknowledge a translated meaning of a sign. So the scholarship mainly focuses on Couteau's and Ponceau's text as the most elaborate defenses of formal signs. And it is right to do so, since they are the main author who developed formal signs. It is what seduces with recent pioneers editors such as Deely and Doyle. However, the position according to which ideas are signs, according to translated meaning and not to a proper meaning, has a richer tradition. It covers a large number of authors. There is Soto, Fonseca, Duarte, Suarez, Valla, Izquierdo, to mention only a few. And it is the position that eventually prevails. So here I put the three main positions on the debate of formal sign. Basically, they are the few supporters of a pure and simple return to Augustine definition, as for instance, Domingo Bañez. So in this version, there are only sensory signs. Then there are the supporters of the formal signs, such are Couteau and Ponceau. And then there is the winning intermediary position with Pedro da Fonseca, who precedes Couteau in Coimbra and initiates the project of Coimbra cursus. Fonseca is a very, very good example of this position, which is not reducible to a mere comeback to Augustine. In fact, even though Fonseca describes the formal sign as an improper sense of sign, it is to be taken more as a translated meaning. It is not the first and strict sense of the term, but nonetheless, it is valuable to describe what happens within mental representation, but only in an analogical sense. Before Fonseca, there is the Dominican Domingo de Soto, and afterwards, there is the super famous Jesuit Francisco Suarez. There are many others as well to illustrate this standpoint. So in other words, the main trend slows down the former dynamic of broadening the definition of the sign. Why do they do so? What are they afraid of? I think that the intermediary solution that eventually prevails at the edge of the early modern period in the scholastic context lies at the end of a road that goes through considering the disadvantages of the broad definition of a sign proposed from the 13th century by Roger Bacon or even Aquinas, and more radically by taking a new turn with Ockhamism and the language of thought hypothesis. So basically that the intermediary solution is a way to slow down the radicalization of the mental language hypothesis. This hypothesis famously proposes that mental language is not merely internal discourse and that concepts are natural signs articulated in a compositional structure, which means that they can be analyzed from a logical grammatical standpoint. Such a thesis seems to have had strong opponents within the post-Ockhamist scholasticism. However, the reject is not totally explicit. This reluctance manifests itself indirectly through the critique of very broad definitions of signs as something that represents something. In a nutshell, signification and representation should not be merged. It is possible to elaborate reasons for not accepting the language of thought hypothesis and the large definition of signs that comes with it. Firstly, one could object that thought has a proper structure which is not syntactical. Thus, it does not seem adequate to claim that the relation between words and ideas on the one hand and ideas and things on the other hand is of the same nature. For this reason, the definition of sign should not be broadened so much as to include mental representation. Secondly, applying linguistic notions to mental representation reinforces the linguistic model, leaving no space for an independent account on signs. However, as said, these reasons to reject the mental language hypothesis are not explicitly found within the scholastic corpus. Besides, it is not a complete rejection, but rather an intermediary position. Formal sign is accepted by the main part of the authors. Also, it is considered as improper. One should ask here, what are the philosophical advantages of a translated use of sign within an expression as formal signs? This will need further investigation, but the idea is the following. Allowing a translated sense of sign is a valuable option to describe natural signification, linguistic communication, and mental representation with one notion, the sign, but without, however, erasing the specificities of these three distinct phenomena. So time to draw some conclusions. In this talk, I contextualized Coimbra semiotic in a longue durée perspective, not as Deely did, looking forward, mainly toward Peirce, but backward, up to Aristotle and Augustine. I know by experience that such long distance and longue durée perspective are risky and easily subject to criticism. However, I think it is useful to measure differences and to size the conceptual issues at stake. Here one can see how three positions on the definition of a sign have been distinguished. There is a narrow or Augustinian definition, whereby a sign is something perceptible by the senses, which leads to knowing something that was not immediately accessible to our senses. Then there is a medieval critique, whereby the narrow definition is broadened so that it includes concepts as signs, namely items that are not perceptible. And finally, there is a nuanced critique of the previous broadening of the definition, whereby following early modern scholastics, it is possible to keep talking of concepts as signs, but as a translated use of a sign. Looking closer at particular tradition has other advantages. It allows a fine reading of the context and provides the possibility of assessing the originality of the authors in relation to others of the same period. Poinçot and Couteau analyses on signs are striking because they are the authors who give a major development to it, and because they are the supporters of this weird conceptual innovation that is the formal sign. However, this is not, during the early modern period, the main position. The rest of scholastics arguing mostly in favor of the intermediary position. And I conclude with this, and I am very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leblanc, for this brilliant and enriching presentation. And now I would like to introduce our commentator, Dr. Maria Kamps. So Dr. Campos earned a PhD in philosophy from the University of Porto with thesis entitled From the Visible to the Invisible, the Theory of Vision in the Commentary on the Three Books on the Soul of the Coimbra Jesuit course. She also holds a master in medieval philosophy from the same university with the thesis The Influence of João de Salisbury, John of Salisbury's Polycrates in the Chronicle of João the First by Fernando Lopes, Legal Political Perspective. Dr. Campos holds also a degree in Humanities from the Faculty of Philosophy of the Catholic University of Portugal and a degree in Law from the Faculty of Law of the University of Lisbon. Dr. Campos currently is a researcher at the Center of Philosophy of the University of Lisbon, at the Institute for Philosophical Studies of the University of Coimbra, and in the Open Universities Chair of Global Studies. Dr. Campos is mainly dedicated to the study and translation of philosophical texts from the late scholasticism, having published several articles and books on the subjects, and notably she is a translator of Coimbra Jesuit course. Dr. Campos, it is an honor for us to have you here today. Thank you very much. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to begin to thanking the organizers of this important event for the gentle invitation to participate in this seminar 2022 International Open Seminar on Semiotics, a tribute to John Deely on the 50th anniversary of his passing, as a commentator of Professor Hélène Leblanc, whom I greet and salute for the excellent lecture she has just given us on formal signs in Coimbra. Well, effectively, the concept of formal sign gained new vigor in the 16th century within the scholastic circles, namely with Sebastião do Couto and João Santo Tomás, João Pensou. They consider, as the professor just said, signs, formal signs like signs par excellence. Mental contents such as concepts, sensible and intelligible species had not previously concerned scholars so much from the point of view of semiotics, but were seen above all as essential mechanisms of the cognitive system, whether sensitive or intelligible. The problems about language take shape from the 16th century onwards and reach their apex nowadays, when philosophers almost leave behind searching the truth to focus on language. Until then, from the ancient philosophers until Middle Age, seeking truth and wisdom was a fundamental scope of philosophers. The truth gradually starts being seen as something unattainable, relative, or even non-existent. This has led to the fact that nowadays, strictly epistemological questions such as the functioning of brain, memory, mechanisms of sensitive apprehension are an almost exclusive object of neuroscience. The philosopher, who is not a doctor, a biologist, or a neuroscientist, should inquire into human nature only through linguistic signs, things that appear to the senses, symbols that link man to the world, sometimes reducing human thought to a set of linguistic games. The meaning, which the significant refers, particularly in formal science, has often become unfathomable, given the impossibility of reaching the being of things, since formal science requires imagination to be decoded. They also need the intervention of intellect in order to reach the reference signatum, according to João Santo Tomás. This something that is out there, the being, says Thomas Aquinas, we are not able to fully perceive because the essence, the being of things, escapes our intellect, but it is possible to reach a part of it, not the whole, as we live surrounded by science. God makes himself known through signs inscribed in nature and in human soul, and man must use the intellect to be able to see the creator in the creature. How do we achieve something of being? With the inner senses and the intellect, according to Sebastião do Couto, everything can be understood, but a part of it can be reached because the human experience of being is possible. We must work on accessing things with imagination, starting from formal signs that are the mental and sensitive material that allows man to do it. Although they are still signs, without them, the imagination cannot operate. It is necessary to make the leap from the language to the referent content, to work on the fantasy that begins to propose things to the intellect in order to reach what is behind the sign. We are capax veritatis, but without the analogy contained in the formal sign, this would not be possible. The cognitive process is based, according to Sebastião do Couto, on these signs. These are the true dynamism, efficient cause that allows connecting man to his surroundings. These signs are the formal signs, since the cognitive power cannot directly unite itself with the object of the senses. The formal signs are mediators. They manifest things through the image, the resemblance through analogy. All creation is a sign and manifests God, allowing man to have his perception. The mechanism of analogy, analogia entis, opens the door to the possibility of natural theology. As man is the image, albeit imperfect, of God, he has a natural ability to know him within the limits of his imperfection. Analogia entis contradicts the Scotist view of university, averse to the possibility of knowing God except from aspects of his will. Sebastião do Couto is aware of the importance of the formal sign as a privileged vehicle of analogy, thus putting himself against those who deny it by underlying that the epistemological process is based on formal signs. It's very important that formal signs are signs to Sebastião do Couto and João Pensot, not in proper sense, which are given by Creator so that man can know and love him, founding a sustaining dialogue of being. Participation in creature is a process, not any form of pantheism. I would like to ask Professor Hélène Leblanc, based on the conception of formal signs of Sebastião do Couto, and I think also João Santo Tomás, if you consider that Sebastião do Couto's theory has a serious opposition to the nominalism. And in affirmative case, if it is possible that Sebastião do Couto, as Jesuit, intended to fight the reformists since they denied the analogia entis, Thank you, Professor Leblanc. It was my pleasure to make this comment.
Thank you very much, Maria Kam. So it was a very, very rich comment, and I would have so many things to say. So thank you so much.
Yes.
By the way, I am not a professor. I am just a doctor. But thank you anyway. Yes, I will begin just with your question. This is a very important question because it really stresses what is at stake with the debate on the formal sign. And as I try to explain in my talk, what is really at stake is, I think, an explicit for the main part of the authors who are speaking about formal signs. For instance, nominalism is there are not so many references, explicit references to nominalism or nominalist authors within the commentary by Kodo, and I think as well in Ponceau. It is very temptful to see their doctrine as in opposition to the radicalization of nominalism, and especially its the fact that it is used, as you stressed, by the reformed milieu. But it remains explicit, and I am not sure that we could claim straightforward that it is only in response to the nominalist claim. I think things are a little more complex than that, and that it is also a way to build or an orthodox Thomism or intermediated thesis between Scotism and Thomism. I think it is something that evolves with the chronology of the late scholastic debate on science. I think the fact that they are answering to the nominalist claim and its use in the reformed area is very much more powerful during the 16th century. But that during the beginning of the 17th century, what is at stake, it's much more the building of a Thomist orthodoxy or a mid-Thomist, mid-Scotist orthodoxy. I would answer that. If I may just, I was very interested by what you said on the doctrine of phenology, because it, on the one hand, it gave spaces to something I hadn't time to say, so it was very useful. And I have also an outline of research that would consist in putting in context this discussion on the formal sign with the different position I try to distinguish. So the return to Augustine, the intermediate position, and the claim in favor of formal sign as proper sign with regard to various versions of the doctrine on analogy. Taking seriously that, for example, the intermediary position is not saying they are formal signs, but just in an improper sense. It could be a reworking of the doctrine of analogy, but just imported in order to think science. So it was very, very useful. I thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if
Thank you very much, Dr. Kamps, for this insightful comment, and it was a pleasure, and it was very instructive to attend this exchange. And I would like to tell to our audience on the YouTube that we will now be closing the broadcast, but the session will continue here on Zoom. And so that everybody will have the opportunity to participate in the discussion and to make a question. You're welcome.